Welcome to Lesson 6.2, Security Assessment Planning. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in Key Area of Knowledge A, which is to design and validate assessment and test strategies. Our topics are going to include selection and scoping, resource requirements, assessor responsibilities, logistics, legal considerations, and rules of engagement. So security assessments, whether they are examinations or tests, should be planned in accordance with your security assessment policies. Security assessments should be managed as a project and should take into consideration the scope of the assessment, the prioritization or the timing of the assessment, the resource requirements, the assessor responsibilities, logistics, legal considerations, and what should be in our rules of engagement. So we're first going to look at a policy and see what we should have in our policies related to doing security assessments, and then we're going to look at each one of these items. So our security assessment policy provides direction and guidance. Remember, policies are high-level governance documents. So a policy should address the following: the roles and responsibilities and reporting structure. So who is responsible for both scheduling, managing, monitoring security assessments, and how are the results of the assessments reported? Any organizational requirements, including regulatory and contractual obligations, should be stated in our policy. The fact that we need to adhere to consistent methodology standards. Now, we're not going to put the standards in the policy. Remember, standards are mandatory specifications. Those will be separate. But the fact that the organization will adhere to our methodology standards, and our adherence to prioritization and frequency standards. Again, those will be separate. Our standards will document prioritization of what systems or processes that we need to be testing and examining, and how often. And lastly, the security assessment policy should state how long the documents related to the assessments should be retained. Let's next look at some of those planning characteristics. Selection of assessment objects are influenced by system criticality, information sensitivity and classification, regulatory requirements, and contractual obligations. So our relevant scoping elements include the size of the system being assessed. Are we talking about one standalone system? Are we talking about hundreds of systems in a complex environment? How complex is the environment? Does it span multiple systems? Does it include both internal and external sources? The feasibility of sampling. If it is a fairly complex environment or fairly large, can we sample and be accurate? And what's the level of expertise and resources that we'll need to engage? Let's look at an example of scoping for different types of firewalls and firewall environments. So we're going to look at size, complexity, and sampling as it relates to remote office firewalls, maybe a primary and backup corporate firewall, or an enterprise edge firewall. So if we're thinking about a remote office, we might say, well, the size, that's pretty small. Should have a small rule set, small configuration, probably not a very complex environment, so we'll give it maybe a medium rating for complexity. And could we sample? Well, if they're all configured the same, we should be able to do sampling. Now, if they're not, then we obviously wouldn't be able to do sampling. If we look at the primary and backup corporate firewall, again, our size might be a mid-size in terms of size. Complexity, it's probably fairly complex. And could we sample? Well, only with the assurance that they're configured exactly the same. So probably sampling here would not be a good expectation. And then we get to our enterprise edge firewall. You know, it may be fairly large, a lot of rules there, a lot of ingress and egress rules. It may be a fairly substantial configuration, could be pretty complex, and probably sampling is not going to be applicable at all. So just thinking about, again, size, complexity, sampling, and then when you look at these, what are the resources that are needed? What is the expertise needed, whether we're doing an examination or testing for these various environments? Resource, which we're going to refer to as assessor, refers to who, which could be an individual or a team, is going to be conducting your engagement. And that could be, again, examination or testing. So our assessor considerations include the level of subject matter expertise required, the availability of the resource, Independence. Now, independence is very important. We want to ensure always that our assessor is independent of the resource or of the object that's being assessed. We want to ensure that there's no conflict of interest. So the chosen assessor or assessment team is responsible for communication of their activities, developing the examination and the test plans, executing the examination and test plans. Now, generally after a test plan is developed, it does go through an approval process, and then it gets executed. So developing, approval, execution. Protecting data in accordance with policy and handling standards. So in an examination, they may be provided confidential data. We need to make sure that all that data is protected in accordance with policy and handling standards. In a test, there may be things that they discover that we need to ensure that is protected as well. The assessor is also responsible for analyzing the data and documenting the outcome. And very often, we will expect our assessors to also develop recommendations. And if applicable, our assessors may conduct additional testing to validate mitigation actions. So they've developed recommendations. If an organization accepts those and then implements them, we then may ask the same assessor to go back and conduct additional testing to validate the mitigation actions. Assessors often face technical, operational, and political challenges. They may get resistance from business owners, system and network administrators, and end users. So it's going to be important for leadership to set the tone for the assessments. Pre-assessment fixes, which are when the custodians who are responsible for the target of the assessment are quickly making changes right before an assessment. In-the-moment mitigation, which is as issues are being discovered, the custodians are quickly running around fixing them. Restricted time windows, which is a limited period of time where they can conduct an examination or a test so that it's not disruptive. Evolving technologies. As an assessor, you have to continually be improving your knowledge of technology so that you can match and understand evolving technology. And always the risk of operational impact. So resistance, the pre-assessment fixes, the in-the-moment mitigation, the restricted time windows, evolving technologies, and risk of operational impact are assessor challenges. And if you're responsible for helping design a test, it's important that you have the perspective and understand what the assessors are going to be facing. Logistical considerations include location, timing, knowledge, and notification. The location of the engagement, we need to consider access to the location, both physical and logical, the security of the engagement location, and if any accounts need to be created for either physical access or logical access. The timing of the engagement considerations include business versus non-business hours, so when is the engagement actually going to take place, and then production versus maintenance windows. And then knowledge and notification, who needs to know about the assessment, internal, third party, and customer, and who needs to be notified that there may be an impact or an operational impact, internal, third party, or customer. Our legal considerations include authorization, liability, indemnification, non-disclosure, and privacy. Now, authorization is often required from third parties that host assessment objects, and not doing so is in violation of a contract. Contracts with external assessors may include SLAs, service level agreements, limitations of liability, and indemnification clauses. So your contract should always be reviewed by legal counsel. Remember, SLAs generally outline the terms of the engagement, including any performance metrics. Limitations of liability will often say that the assessor has no liability if something goes wrong, if there's a problem during the test. And indemnification is who bears the cost or the expense if there's any additional cost or expense that are incurred because of the examination or the test. Potential privacy violations should be identified. What type of information might be exposed during the test? Non-disclosure contracts or agreements should protect disclosure of data collection and findings. A Rules of Engagement document, an ROE, details the parameters and the expected assessor conduct of the assessment. So rules of engagement components will include the scope, any assumptions that are being made, any limitations, and the risks, logistics, such as personnel, the test schedule, the test site, and equipment, the communications plan, what the target system is and the target system boundaries, and the testing expectations and data handling requirement. All of those should be clearly documented in the Rules of Engagement document, as well as who the findings should be reported to. So let's review Lesson 6.2. We talked about selection and scoping, the resource requirements, assessor responsibilities, logistics, our legal considerations, and our Rules of Engagement document. So that's going to bring us to our Match the Meaning for Lesson 6.2. So the terms I want to make sure that you're comfortable and familiar with are selection, prioritization, logistics, scope, and ROE, indemnification, and then two that you've seen earlier, due diligence and due care. So go ahead, put me on pause, take a few minutes, match up the meanings, come on back, and we'll do them together. All right, let's try our Lesson 6.2 terms. Selection, that's determining the assessment objects to be included. Our prioritization is the importance of or the order of. When we have a lot of assessments to do, we have to prioritize them. The logistics, well, logistics may include location, time, notification. The scope includes the size and the complexity, and if we're going to be doing any sampling. An ROE is a Rules of Engagement document. Indemnification is responsibility for cost of loss. Remember, due diligence was the act of investigating, and due care is prudent action. So when we're doing security assessments, we're really fulfilling both due diligence and due care. We are continuing to investigate and ensure that our controls are working, and that we are taking prudent action. And prudent action would be this iterative cycle of always reviewing our environment. So that's going to bring us to our CISSP exam tips for this lesson. Remembering that a security assessment policy provides direction and guidance, which is really just our definition of all policies. Authorization is often required from third parties that host assessment objects. Assessment objects are your targets of assessment. And extensive due diligence should be conducted on your external assessors. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.